Good evening, everyone. My name is Tyler Okamoto. I'm the acting head of school here at UQ Business School, and I'm your MC for this evening. First and foremost, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, the Yagara and Turrbal people here in Brisbane. On behalf of UQ, I'd like to pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. And I think this is particularly apt given the topic of today's webinar. The custodianship of the lands is really an integral element to what we're going to be talking about tonight. So thank you for joining us this evening for our Thought Leadership webinar, where we're going to be discussing how organizations can succeed within ecological limits. Now, at UQ, this is something that is quite close to what we try to achieve here. We have a business and sustainability initiative research hub, which tries to lead the way in a rapidly changing business landscape by championing environmentally and socially conscious business practices and helping to design strategies for a sustainable future. Now, this initiative is headed by our UQ researchers who are international leaders in their fields, with a depth of knowledge spanning corporate sustainability, social impact and entrepreneurship, capital markets, and tourism. Industry and government partnerships do play a key role in what the Business Sustainability Initiative does. And there's really a vast array of funded projects that are underway. We really try to engage stakeholders at all levels of the public, from small business to large enterprises. And so if the topic of today's webinar is at all interesting to what you and your organizations do, please do reach out and connect to the Research Hub, and we can see if we have some common ground and potentially find a way to work together. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to say that if you had any questions throughout the presentation for the speakers as they come to mind, feel free to go ahead and add those to the Q&A function below. We're going to hold these questions and ask them at the end of the presentations during the panel session. Captions are also embedded for this session, so if you'd like to turn these on, all you have to do is go to the live transcript button below. Now, this evening, you're going to hear from a handful of experts, but to kick us off on this topic, we're going to have a short presentation, first from Dr. Cle-Anne Gabriel, and then Cameron Reid. I'll start by giving a brief bio about each one of them. First, Cle-Anne Gabriel is a researcher and expert in the area of post-growth futures. I knew I'd trip up on that one. Renewable energy enterprise and business models for sustainability. She's worked on projects and assignments funded by organizations such as AusAid, the EU, and New Zealand's Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. In fact, she designed and delivered an energy baseline study for the city of Dunedin in New Zealand and provided policy advice on the city's energy plan and the lead up to its ascension to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. Our second speaker will be Cameron Reid, who is an associate director within KPMG's Climate Change and Sustainability team, where he leads the delivery of climate risk, decarbonization, and transition across industry, government, and financial services. Cameron brings 2 decades of experience across energy, finance, and professional service, with unique insights into the challenges of climate change and carbon policy, sustainability, and ESG strategy, as well as policy development. Cameron has authored a range of corporate and academic publications on the energy industry, a carbon-constrained future, and the challenges of transition. Now, with those introductions, we're going to hear first from Cle-Anne, who will then hand over to Cameron, and then we'll reconvene after that for a Q&A with our panelists. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Tyler, for the introduction. And thanks very much for having me to the BSI Research Hub, and also to the organizers at this UQ Business School who made this webinar possible tonight. So I've been asked to speak today on the subject of limits, and to get us started and provide a bit of context for what Cameron will present for us today. And those of you who are familiar with my work will know that when I speak of limits, I speak of ecological planetary limits. And I speak of limits in the context of what I think is becoming increasingly apparent, even to those who are new to this to the sustainability space, And that's that we can't continue as we have been forever. We live on a planet of finite resources. And so we need to find a way to live within the context of that planet of having these finite resources. We need to find a way to live within what I call these ecological limits. And that means using natural resources in a way that is much more sustainable. It means that within these limits, to the limits globally on a planetary scale to what our planet can sustain, we need to find ways to reduce how much we take, so the resource consumption. We need to find ways to reduce the degradation of the natural environment. And then we need to find ways to to create these more circular flows within these limits of our natural planet. So circular flows of materials and energy. So that's often, when I speak of ecological limits, often the mood is one of sort of negativity, because we think that when we speak of ecological limits, that this is something quite new, and it potentially threatens, well, it does threaten the status quo, but it does not necessarily need to be negative. So the first thing I'd like to say on that next slide is that actually for a very, very long time, corporations have always worked within limits. In fact, it is from a financial perspective, the very basis of corporate decision-making, of business decision-making is one of limits. We work within budgetary constraints every day. Every organization everywhere in the world has budgetary constraints. And our limits are not only financial, they're also social. So somewhere along the way, and this came through in a conversation that Cameron and I had a couple of weeks ago as well, somewhere along the way, we accumulated certain experiences and knowledge that taught us that actually there is also a limit to how much, how many, to the human rights infractions that we're willing to endure in pursuit of profits. Somewhere along the way, we decided that we are not going to continue to pursue profits if it risks the safety of our employees. It's the reason we speak of health and safety, for example. Somewhere along the way, we decided that even if our profits, if it cuts into our profits a little bit, we will invest in fair trade. So issues of ethics, responsibility, of maintaining our social acceptance and social license to operate, they all entail or include this concept of limits. We agree, even now in the world today, that there are some things we are not willing to do at all costs, at any cost. So there's underlying logic in terms of the way that businesses operate and the way that we generate value, the way we can measure and calculate costs, etc. But there's also an underlying ethic, underlying values that there are limits to how much we'll spend and how much we'll make if it infringes on these on particular social rights and freedoms. So ecological limits now. When we speak of ecological limits, it's a sort of the same concept, but we forget that within this, that we already have at our disposal the framing for dealing with limits and operationalizing them within our organizations. And the reality is that our corporations, the world's businesses, exist within this context of planetary limits. The problem, or the challenge, I would say, rather than problem, is that they're very, very difficult to manage, because the challenge as we know it is a planetary one. This is a global challenge involving multiple countries, multiple nation states, multiple individuals, corporations, small businesses, and ecosystems across the world. And so it becomes very difficult to allocate responsibility, and it becomes very difficult to measure. We need some sort of innovation in metrics. And it's the reason I think I saw in the chat, the first bubble that popped up from the chat was someone mentioning circularity. I mean, circularity is essentially what we are aiming for, but it is circularity on a local or regional scale. So scale matters. On a global scale, it is a context of limitations. And that's just the reality of the planet that we live on. But the challenge is, as I said, scaling this global context of limitations to a local or regional level, where we need to figure out a way to be circular in our use and reuse of resources and energy, where we need to find a way to stay within defined ecological budgets. And I use the word budget there very deliberately, bearing in mind that the previous slide I had here spoke about financial limits as well. So if we can consider ecological limits in the same way from the perspective of ecological budget and ecological spend, for example. What we actually need, in addition to metrics that help us to somehow calculate ecological budgets, help us to figure out what our optimal use and reuse of resources are on local, regional, or company scales, the scale of individual corporations. What we also need fundamentally is a shift in values, a change in the rules of which businesses operate. And the big question that we have today is, can corporations also agree, just like with these social limits that are now completely mainstream and that we accept, can we also agree that perhaps we will not pursue endless profits or profits infinitely at any cost to the natural environment? Are we willing to impose those kinds of limits as well on our organizations? And the only way to do that is to shift our values and to change the rules of the game. And so this is why when we speak of changing the rules of the game, I want to get into the subject here of governance. And there's an agreement that big, grand, difficult challenges like the one we're facing now, like climate change, ecological destruction, species extinction, all the other ecological challenges and the limits within which we live on a global scale are the very reason that governments exist. I mean, these are big, grand, complicated, complex challenges that are difficult to tackle, difficult to define, and difficult to solve, or challenging, I should say. We already have many of the tools we need to solve them at our disposal, but our governments are the ones who set the rules. Our governments need to find a way to set the limits. They decide what is right or wrong, and they create the legal and social infrastructures within which the corporations play in our societies and within which these corporations operate. And without that shift in values and frameworks, then there's not as much incentive for individual businesses and indeed more international and global corporations to enact these ecological limitations and internalize them actually into their day-to-day operations. So this is the reason that these governments exist. Our governments, and it's the reason that Jacinda Ardern, for example, in the, not this year, previous 2 years budget was speaking of this well-being budget, where she was trying essentially to create these limitations that focus not just on economic wealth, but also on social and ecological wealth. And so she was trying there to change the rules, to put in place these limits, and then the corporations within that national jurisdiction then had to find ways to adapt their reporting, their operations, supply chains, etc., to fit within these limits. And so it's the reason that our governments exist on a national and on a global scale to solve problems that don't just touch on individual localities and individual businesses and organizations, but that touch on the complex web of interactions between all of these. And as we know, as we've seen with the latest IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, a lot of the responsibility for responding has indeed been placed at the level of governments and nation states. So this is my introduction, and that's my broad summary of, or the context, I would say, not summary, for why we are focusing on ecological limits. It's a global context. And now the question is, how do corporations respond to this challenge? How do they find a way to contextualize this planetary scale challenge within their own jurisdictions and within the context of individual value chains. And so at this point, I want to introduce Cameron next, who is the Associate Director for Climate Change and Sustainability at KPMG. And I'm really pleased for Cameron to share now the corporate perspective on the challenge and why this is challenging for individual corporations. Cameron?
Thank you, Cle-Anne, and thank you both to University of Queensland and to everybody on the other side of the camera. I'm going to say first up, this is my first webinar to such a large audience, so please be forgiving of me if I tend to stutter a little bit and maybe look away from my camera. It's interesting that Cle-Anne spoke earlier about, changing the rules of the game, because one of the big challenges for corporations is that whilst they may be able to have that discussion around what the rules of the game should be and how the game may be played, once they, to continue with that analogy, cross that white line and are on the field of business, there is only what they have to abide by the rules of the game that exist at that time. And sometimes that can create challenges for organizations, particularly in instances whereby they may recognize that the rules may not be fit for purpose, may not have caught up with societal expectations and the like. As was alluded to earlier, in the team that I work within KPMG, we have 65 professionals across the country, and we work in everything from advisory and strategy through to assurance. And that often is a good way of thinking about the spectrum of limits, because ultimately when something gets to a hard limit, that is generally where you're talking about the laws of regulation and regulation and legislation and the like. But I'm just going to take a few minutes now just to walk through a couple of perspectives from the corporate or from company side, and just the way that sustainability, ESG, corporate social responsibility, all of these different terms for fundamentally the same thing, how they're thought through from an organizational perspective and where some of those challenges can be, and ideally through those challenges where we can find some solutions about dealing to those ecological limits and boundaries that Cle-Anne spoke about. What I've got up here on that first slide is just a couple of key points from some work that KPMG has done. It was released late last year, and that's looking at that N100 is actually the 100 companies from 52 different 100 companies from 52 countries. So the sample size is about 5,200. 80% of them have sustainability reporting as part of their processes, which sounds great. Sustainability has been on the rise for a number of years now. But interestingly, what we're talking about here is that only 25% of them, or less than 25% of them, report on biodiversity loss, which is one of those ecological limits that was referred to earlier. And so the question becomes, where do you find that link between what companies report on and what are the structural issues? Interestingly, it's the mining sector that is the leading organization for the reporting on the challenges associated with biodiversity loss. And the question, and I genuinely can't answer this question, but the question then becomes, why is it that they are the ones that are reporting on that biodiversity loss? Is it necessarily because they are the ones that are impacting that loss of biodiversity, or is it that they have the most to lose from not reporting on that biodiversity? Do they have a range of stakeholders who are very interested in what it is that they are doing? These are some of the challenges about just because a corporation is putting out a sustainability report, is it focusing on the right things? And what are the right things when you talk about that? If we look at the next slide, one of the challenges for corporations, and this is actually much of what I'm going to speak to is through the lens of climate change over the coming few slides, is that the timeframes that we're talking about can often challenge corporations who work in smaller cycles, whether it be 3 months, 6 months, even the sort of 3 and 5 year, anything past 5 years to a decade can be considered long term. I mean, some corporations will have very long-lived assets, but the majority of them will be thinking in those sort of timeframes of the next 5 to 7 years at max. Whereas something like a climate change, something like the other ecological limits have, they have timeframes that are decadal by nature. It always makes me think when you sit there and say, from the time that we started formally at a global level talking about the issues of climate change, we've actually emitted more CO2 into the atmosphere from that time to now than we had done all of the time before it. And so even if we know that something is an issue, what are the processes that we need to go through to ensure that that starts to filter down from a known problem to something that creates boundaries and limits for corporations? And I think that's the key. How is it that you take this notion and make it real and tangible for an organization? Sometimes that can take a lot longer than is actually desired, even in the cases of from a societal expectation perspective. But it does happen, sometimes not overnight, but it does happen. Because as we can see on the next slide, here is just some of the changes in carbon reduction targets and some of the reporting on that. In my field as a practitioner, we've seen a massive rise in net zero discussions around alignment with Paris goals and the like. But what we can see here is that even in the last 3 years, that percentage has increased significantly. That being said, okay, there is still a lot that aren't linked to targets, but we are starting to see movement. Once people and organizations can start to link their targets through to global goals and then potentially jurisdictional or even national goals, then they can start to create boundaries and parameters. I remember in a previous role that the greatest thing that we could do was to actually take Australia's carbon budget and transfer that into the sector that I was working in at the time, and then actually down to the organizational level, which was able to give us a sort of a constraint or a factor to work within to understand the impact on the organization. I'm just going to push through there because that normalization of understanding what the boundaries are is really important from a corporate perspective. But one of the other things that's needed is to be able to look at the issue, whatever it is, starting to understand what those limits are and what they might be within a particular context, and then start to, as we can see on the next slide, start to think about what does it actually mean for the business? And how do you frame it within the context of a business organization? These here, there's some other aspects as well. These are drawn very much from the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that is very relevant and prevalent within the discussion in and around climate change. These are some of those drivers from the regulatory legal perspective, the risk aspects of climate change, but also the fact that investors are looking to see how people are managing and addressing these risks. What that does is starts to frame something that is seen as an ecological, sometimes environmental constraint, and starts to put that into the context of business so that people start thinking, how does that risk permeate itself through my organization? How do I respond to it? What does it actually mean for me? What does it mean for my stakeholders? So what we can see from that is that once an issue is framed up like that, you can start to get traction. Again, that can take a little bit of time, and it's important that sometimes we have to allow that to work its way through. I know that the TCFD launched in 2015, came into being in 2017. Some of the amount of companies that we've seen that are now reporting in alignment with that, it's gone through the roof. It's risen faster than the amount of people doing sustainability reporting. And you can see that if we move to the next slide, that normalization process is starting to be the precursor for legislation. We're starting to see with TCFD, we've taken a global context that's got a limit. It's now starting to work its way through the business and investment community to understand what the impacts are on business. And you're starting to see that that is now being referred to in legislation and you're actually starting to see countries and jurisdictions that are implementing it as something that organizations need to comply with. You can see that on the next slide. So it's slide 16, where there's a number of different countries that have foreshadowed an implementation of TCFD from a legislative perspective. And for most other countries, it's starting to become a form of what you would call soft legislation. So we can actually kick over straight into the next slide. I realize I've been going on a little bit, but what I'm trying, I suppose, what the main thing when dealing with ecological limits inside a corporation is for there are so many different things that companies are trying to consider at any given time. And there is such a focus on materiality. What are the things that are important, not only to my organization, but what are important to my stakeholders? And that can be the general public, that could be regulatory, that could be financial, that could be special interest groups and the like. But why is it important to my organization? And then I need to understand, once I know what's important, I need to understand the issue. This is how things move from those, you start talking to whether it be people from an environmental perspective or a social perspective, and move those issues into the center to understand what it means for the business. And that's how the businesses can then best engage in the discussions with government, with regulators, about appropriate types of limits that can be put in and how you would actually start to integrate those into the business cycle. It's really, it can often be a long and torturous and occasionally painful process. Anybody who works in the climate space knows that. And there are a whole range of other things that now, on the back of climate change, we need to move forward on. I'm going to end my discussion with the fact that when talking about these limits, often it's the challenges that we face are very rarely siloed. And this is where I get to sing for my supper, so to speak, but to talk about KPMG impact. So KPMG has recognized that many of the challenges that we face require a whole range of different perspectives to actually inform the solutions. And that's why, from a global perspective, we're looking at a range of these challenges across our business, and that's everything from finance through tax and assurance and consulting and all of the different things that we do, because we realize that it takes a whole range of services to get through and help companies understand how they can play a role in managing, trying to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. I'm going to stop there. So thank you very much again for your time. I'm going to hand back to our host, who will take us forward from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cle-Anne, as well as Cameron, for your really insightful presentations. We're now going to open up to the panel for some Q&A, but I wanted to just start by introducing our two additional panelists. First, we have Dr. Andrea La Nauze, who is a lecturer in the School of Economics at the University of Queensland. She's an economist who incorporates insights from behavioral economics into the study of environmental problems. So using economic models, field experiments, and observational data, her work tries to understand the impacts of household behavior on environmental policy outcomes and the effects of environmental conditions on behavior. Our second additional panelist is Isabel Franco. Isabel Franco is a research fellow at UQ in the Australian Institute for Business and Economics. She's an emerging leader in sustainable development, sustainability science, policy, and practice, and she's interested in exploring the role of industry in fostering sustainable and inclusive development. Her ongoing research, impact, and practice really aim to try to understand the role of the industry in achieving transformational and sustainable change at scale. To kick off the questions, I thought I might take advantage of the opportunity of having the floor to ask a couple of questions of Andrea and Isabel to start us off. So perhaps first for you, Andrea, what is the social cost of carbon, and how would you actually calculate this? We heard from the speakers about the importance of stakeholders, but what is that? How do you actually go about monetizing that?
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So The social cost of carbon is essentially a way of monetizing these boundaries, these ecological boundaries. So specifically, when it comes to climate change, we can either try and think about, net zero as a target for society to achieve in terms of carbon reductions, or we can try and think about, well, what is the price of carbon? What is the dollar amount of damage that is caused by a ton of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere? And so why is that an important thing to know? Well, from a very practical sense, it actually gives corporations, it gives individuals a sense of, well, what sorts of actions should I be undertaking, right? If we understand what the costs of reducing a ton of carbon dioxide are, and we can compare that to the social cost of carbon, then any action that is lower in value, right, than the damage caused by carbon should be undertaken, right? So from a corporation's perspective, it's essentially like saying it's a good investment, right? Any carbon reduction that you can undertake that costs you less than the social cost of carbon, you should be doing it from a planetary perspective.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andrea. That's a really useful way to think about things. Maybe a question for Isabel as well. Both Cameron and Cle-Anne touched on the role of regulation and governance in actually making a difference in this space. Could you elaborate on why climate change governance is so important from your particular perspective on an international scale?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Tyler, for the question, and thank you for the panelists and for the invite. Well, first of all, I would like to clarify that governance is not only, we are not talking only about the role of the government, but also about the role and responsibilities of different stakeholders, private sector, government, and civil society organizations. I'm going to give a couple of examples from my practice and the work I did at the UN, policy relevant research, and in which actually I could see firsthand the role of each one of these actors and how they had an impact on the social, in terms of social and environmental outcomes. So the first one was that when I was working at UNESCAP, we found actually, and this is something that Cameron mentioned before, you said that 80%, you found that 80% of companies were reporting, but actually 20% reporting on biodiversity, and you found the mining sector being one of those that reported on that specific component. Actually, an investigation that we conducted with colleagues at UNESCAP, we found that in the banking and finance sector, there's different sector, different industry, only 2% of those companies, of the companies' research actually were fully accountable to sustainability outcomes. So that was an issue that we found. So and in that specific case, the corporations actually took the lead and they said, well, we have to do something about it. So UNESCAP has something that is called EBAC, which is the ESCAP Business Council Advisory Council. And they committed to sustainability, and they say, well, let's commission a study and come up with something tangible. So I participated in that research in which we help corporations actually to build a model to sustainable business so that they could track all the process, across the supply chain and actually deliver sustainable outcomes both for the company, for the communities, and the environment where they operate. So as you see in that case, for example, it wasn't the government actually that took the lead, but it was the corporation in partnership with an international organization, which is the United Nations. So that the governance environment was a bit different. In another case was Africa. So it was Asia Pacific. Another case was in Africa, where the main social issue was actually, that was in Angola, in Luanda, where I had the opportunity to work with UNDP. And the main issue actually was more around transparency in social issues. So if you go to Luanda, to Angola, Luanda is the capital of Angola, and in 2012 it was the most expensive city in the world. But if you go to Luanda, even though if it is an oil-based economy, is very poor, right? So I think the nicest buildings belong to Total and another oil company. But at the time when I was in Luanda, there was a malaria pandemic, and there were quite a few social issues around London and the communities where I was working with. And so the issue at the time was a governance issue that came from the government. So the government said, we need help, we need assistance, we want to take the lead because we don't want Angola to be in the same state that it is now with oil. We have a lot of oil, but look what has happened so far. We don't want the same because now Angola is booming in terms of mining, minerals and metals. So we really want to deliver something tangible for the communities and the environment where mining companies will operate. So we did an interesting research, policy relevant research with Katoka mine site, which is one of the largest diamond mine sites in Africa, and in which we help the government, the Ministry of Geology and Mines, to write the mining code in alignment with corporate sustainability policies and mandates, and also in partnership with the UN. So one of the recommendations out of this policy relevant research was that UN, the ministry should work hand in hand with the International Transparency Initiative so that the monies coming from mining could deliver actually sustainable outcomes for the community. And that actually worked very well for the community and for all the stakeholders involved, particularly for the government. So those results were later revealed, disseminated with the international, UN International Assembly, and they were well received. So as you can see, and later on with colleagues with the United Nations University, we wanted to explore that issue. Why is it that we have different sustainability outcomes in different parts? Because it's context-based. In a piece of that we published on sustainability science, we did that global study in which we found that actually, Africa, for example, is more focused on social outcomes, sustainability and social sustainability. Asia Pacific is more focused on environmental issues. And Europe, for example, is also environmental focus, and Latin America is more social. So the context is very important. And another interesting finding is that we found that there is lack of we reviewed what is called the voluntary national reviews, which are actually the commitment of countries to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we found that countries still need like an accountable party so that different stakeholders can deliver sustainable outputs for all the stakeholders, because it's not only government, it's all the stakeholders, civil society and private sector. So that's pretty much on my end.
Yeah. Thank you, Isabel. And that actually is kind of raises an interesting question that dovetails very nicely into one of our questions in the chat about how we address chronic government policy failure to deal with ecological damage. So we have an anonymous attendee saying that often it seems as if there's a disconnect between voter desires and political action, or a voting population which doesn't seem concerned enough about climate change. And the question for the panel is that they're curious about whether corporations have a role in shaping voter behavior.
I don't know. I'll have a crack at it. It's a really good question. It's a really vexed question. I think because if you want corporations to get involved, is it only in the issues that you feel are the right ones? Because that's where you start to raise those challenges about what it is that corporations get involved in. But ultimately, it's, from my perspective, it's one of those challenging things where as a company, you need to be able to segregate the difference between managing the risks associated with an issue and what is the position on an issue. Climate change, archetypal example. I'm going to use a wine company, one, because it generally gets people's attention, but two, to think about, so a wine company may absolutely want action on climate change. That's not going to stop them buying land potentially in, let's say, Tasmania or New Zealand or otherwise to manage what it knows is a likely outcome of climate change, that you're going to have temperature shifts across, and they're actually going to want land there. So sometimes the challenge there is to separate the action that is purely a business action versus an organization taking a stance to say, this is what we expect of our elected officials in order to address the issues that are before us. It's a really vexed question, but a very interesting one.
Thank you, Cameron. Cle-Anne, I see your head is shaking. Do you have some thoughts on this one?
Yeah, perhaps some radical thoughts, but it's a safe space of 94 people, so I'll do it anyway. I wanted to say that corporations, and depends, of course, on the size of, I'm aware of that, the size of the company. Some small businesses don't have the same sort of power. But through our advertising, for example, the corporations can influence values through things like lobbying and the kinds of, and actually, let's be honest, in the world's most quote unquote successful modern day societies, political endeavor is sponsored by business very often and corporations. So to the extent that a corporation has that power to influence political action, then they absolutely have a responsibility to do so. And I think increasingly, consumers, are we getting down to the individual consumer level, consumers expect the companies that are producing their products, are expecting their governments, etc., to act in more, not just socially ethical ways, but also to be more ecologically responsible. And I think, so the question is, do corporations have a role to play? I say yes, but I say we need everyone. So when I started by speaking about government, I was simply trying to draw that, to start off with the bigger context, right? But we need action at all different scales. So, and for example, one of the things, so this is something we teach currently at the moment in our this new carbon literacy program that we have, is that something like, we estimate it's like 70% of the change that we need to see to achieve net zero targets has to happen at the systemic level. And 30% is individual. Now, that means that you can, so 30% of the solution is on all 93 of us. Now we've lost somebody on the call. So that's 30% of us, not just in our purchasing decisions, and our purchasing decisions are influenced by corporations and advertising and all of these things and social pressures. It's our 30% contribution are in our choices of, you know, what we eat, transportation options, etc. Our 30% is also in who we vote for. It's sort of it's also about where we decide to spend and not spend our dollars. It's in the kind of corporations and initiatives that we choose to support or not support. So we have 30% of power, if those statistics and all of that are right. But there's a 70% responsibility that's systemic. And that's a really, I think it's quite fraught, sort of asking about who's responsible for system change. It's government, definitely, and Isabel's right. We're not just talking about the government. There are a whole range of different stakeholders and factors that play in this conversation of governance. It's also the larger corporations, the larger businesses, for example. So, but we as individuals can influence them with our dollars and our vote. And so I guess for me, from my perspective, the answer is yes, corporations do have a role to play in shaping individual behavior. Corporations could also shape larger systemic change if they have that power or that range and that scale. And just to touch on what Andrea mentioned, because she said, you know, that pricing is a way of monetizing these ecological limits and ecological boundaries. And when we monetize it and there's a price to carbon, it sends signals out to the market, and those signals come back to what Cameron mentioned about materiality. So it becomes important for a company to take this seriously, becomes material if there's, I mean, the price signals is one way that helps these things to become material as well. So that's it's perhaps quite a long-winded response there, but I think my answer is yes. But my answer is also we need everybody. It's not, there's no one silver bullet solution. It's not just corporations, it's not just governments, and it's not just individuals either.
Yeah,
I would like to add something if I can.
Yeah, go ahead, Isabel.
Yeah, so indeed, I mean, corporations have a key role. They play a key role in delivering sustainable outcomes, both for the community and the environment. But the thing is, you know, how they deliver that. And what we found in our research and policy relevant research is that companies should look at the core business, right? For example, I'll give you an example, the resource sector. Why in the research sector, a corporation is going to be, if they're looking, for example, at education or health, right? The core business is mining, right? It's minerals and resources. Why not, for example, enhancing, and we documented a few cases in which they enhance the skills of small miners in developing location, in developing countries where they operate. And actually those initiatives contribute to the business, right? So that help them to mitigate the business risk and also social risk. And that also facilitated the social license to operate, because the issue is that when companies, particularly in the resource sector, try to expand operations, that's where the problem begins. If they do the right thing in one community, then they can move forward in the next community. And we saw that case in Canada, of a Canadian company operating in Latin America. We documented that case. The company came, the community in community A, they realized that they were not delivering sustainable outputs for the community and environment. And then they denied, community B realized that, and they denied the social license to operate. The Canadian company went back, they rebranded, and even though they rebranded, they came back to Latin America, but the community said, no, you cannot operate here. They lost massive millions of dollars because of this, and they were ready to start operations. They had already invested a lot of amount of money during exploration, which was 4 years. And so that's the cost of not taking responsibility. And communities are more aware because they have been triggered by civil society organizations and international organizations such as the UN and so on. So there is a responsibility, and there are some countries that actually are taking that responsibility. India, for example, in India, CSR is mandatory, and TCFD, for example, in other countries such as Brazil, is becoming mandatory. So definitely there is an accountability from the private sector, and but also obviously all different stakeholders have roles and responsibilities to meet.
Yeah. Thanks, Isabel. And in fact, you mentioned social license to operate. Cle-Anne talked about the 30%, which actually links to a couple of the questions that have come through the chat, specifically about the role of customers in all of this. And really kind of, there's two ideas that have come through. One is about potentially shifting customer attitudes that should naturally flow on to governments and corporations. And the second is about actually providing the knowledge to make those informed decisions by, for example, putting a carbon label on products so that people can make informed decisions and do business with the corporations that they believe are doing the right thing. I know that decision-making, environmental decision-making is your area of expertise, Andrea. Do you have any thoughts on this sort of question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess especially maybe the latter suggestion of labeling, and I guess I'm sorry to harp on about the social cost of carbon, but I guess a really great metric would be to, ideally we would price in the cost of the ecological damage that we cause by producing and using resources, and that would be embedded in the actual price of the products that we see on the shelf. I think a second best or a step on the way there would be to actually label that damage. But I think monetizing the damage and understanding what the dollar value of that damage is really important, because it also assists further upstream. It assists companies and the producers of those products to be making really efficient, smart choices about where are we going to reduce carbon, right? We want to be reducing carbon in the cheapest possible way. We have a lot to do. So we want to ensure that we're doing it in the least cost manner. And if we price carbon at all stages of the production process, we give incentives at all stages of the production process to ensure that we are accounting for the full damage and the full cost of our products. So I think labeling is potentially a valuable policy intervention, or even if it's sort of a voluntary initiative. But in addition, I think to actually monetizing and ensuring that the full costs of the products we purchase are accounted for.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andrea. Any other thoughts from the panelists on this one?
I was just going to say, look, I tend to agree with Andrea that where you can get the price systemically into the supply chain or into the process thinking, then you're going to start to, one change permeates all the way through. And it's amazing, often we think about corporations, companies, entrepreneurs, all of those. Generally, they're responding to some form of incentive, whether that incentive be a dollar incentive or otherwise. And it is truly amazing what can be, you've seen the price of renewable energy come down like a roller coaster over the last decade because of the incentives that have been there and what people are seeing. You're seeing the same thing with batteries at the moment. The advances in technology are just phenomenal. And by putting those things in there, you basically harness the power of corporations for a positive purpose. You start to align the incentives, and it doesn't matter whether they're doing it because they want to be rich or because they want to be famous or because they want to be good. They're all still doing something that is towards our benefit.
And I guess just to add to that, I was doing a bit of quick desktop research before this webinar today. And it's not, so normally when we think about carbon pricing, we think about this being a government policy to implement some sort of carbon price. But in fact, a lot of corporations have gone their own way and actually implemented what's called an internal carbon price. So they treat carbon as any other cost of doing business, and it's actually monetized and it's in their systems of accounts. And so apparently, according to the World Bank, about 22% of global emissions are covered by some sort of voluntary internal carbon price. So where is that coming from? Well, it's coming from corporations. So I guess back to the other question, I guess it's not really an issue of should corporations be involved and should we demand action. Corporations are already doing a lot in terms of getting ready and moving the ball along.
Yeah, thanks for that. And as we're talking about this, I'm also seeing another question from Susan about really how we're using the word corporation, and that really what we should be looking at here is looking at across the spectrum, not just corporations, but also small businesses. She mentions the entrepreneurs. Yeah. That one always sticks on my tongue. Sole traders, things like that, and how we can think about bridging all of those different organizational models, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, look, I firmly believe that's the future. I think we're using the word corporation very loosely here, and we're probably also using it in the context of KPMG being, Cameron representing KPMG. But I think there's an understanding that we mean all forms of organization. But I do think that there's a really important place for small businesses, for local community-based organizations. If we are thinking about how to actually scale down these ecological limits to the local level and local scale, then it's going to have to involve community initiatives. It's going to have to involve car sharing, for example, services, instead of each of our neighbors owning 2 cars each, for example. I mean, the limits are real. How we make them real and enact them on our local scale, that's the real challenge. So I do think that when we use the word corporations and we're speaking much more broadly, there's an important role for them to play, but we cannot, Susan is right, we absolutely can't discount the mompreneurs and the local businesses and the mom and pop shop down the road and the very local grassroots organizations that also, because remember that the aim is not just to scale back within limits. The aim is to be happy within those limits, right? The aim is to have thriving communities and societies. We want to actually still feel like we've maintained basic standards of human dignity. And the way we do that is by finding ways to be happy in our communities.
So on the topic of those limits, Cle-Anne, we have a question about, okay, so we should all have ecological budgets, that it does raise a really difficult practical problem about the allocation of those budgets and how you actually go about allocating them and challenges with measurement and all of those sorts of issues. So it's just curious if you or any of the other panelists had thoughts on that particularly tricky problem.
I'm just looking down the participant list to see if Sophia is here. I don't think she is, but because I was going to talk about the science-based targets, you know, that the aim, and I don't think it's perfect in any way. Actually, none of these things are perfect, but they are excellent ways to start. The science-based target initiative tries to do just that, to sort of figure out, okay, on this global scale, you need to reduce by X many gigatons of carbon. This is the footprint, or this is the footprint of your value chain, of your supply chain. And so given that that's the footprint of your supply chain, in order to reach that particular target, you need to reduce. And you would actually calculate a precise carbon budget to stay within those limits. And they're called science-based targets because they're based on climate science, essentially. So that's already underway. And actually you can Google science-based targets initiative and find a list of companies that are already signing up. There are quite a few in Australia as well. Now, I don't want us to give the impression that it's perfect, because it's not. And I have my own personal views about them, which I won't share here. But this notion of ecological budgeting is complex, but it's already underway. And there are a lot of people working on that.
I think that is a very good point what you make, Cle-Anne. However, I would like to point out that there are communities, for example, that so how we localize those budgets, those science-based, you know, budgets, ecological budgets, right? And because we have documented the case of communities in which, I mean, they don't have the skills, they don't have the knowledge to create, you know, and implement such budgets. So they need the participation of different stakeholders. It could be private sector or government to help them on that process, right? To budget social outcomes and environmental outcomes. So the is key, you know, that the government or private sector they participate in upskilling those communities to be active participants of their own development as well, and localize that science, right? You know, so that's what I wanted to, yeah.
Great.
I was just going to say very, very quickly, Tyler, that, you know, I mean, I wouldn't be so gratuitous as to say what you need is a really good accounting firm. That would be very, very gratuitous of me to say. But the challenges around that dissemination of budgets, I think it actually, one of the key things, we're talking about planetary boundaries, ecological limits. It does flow down from that sort of almost that nation state approach, and needs to filter down to be, I suppose, let's call it a positive form of trickle down economics. But we need to actually start to break that down, because the majority of corporations and organizations need to work within, going back to what we said at the start, within the rules of the game that exist at that point in time. And for many organizations, small ones in particular, going out and actually finding out all of this information on their own bat, they're looking sometimes for guidance, because they're trying to focus on what it is that their core business is. And so governments, industry organizations, academic institutions, organizations like mine need to help them by being part of that information flow about these limits.
Thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Cameron. And I am noticing that that we're creeping past 6, and so despite the fact that there's still a lot of really interesting and useful thoughts and comments in the chat box, I probably should wrap it up. I might end on one particular question here from Catherine, who's talking about her company who's about to embark on a journey to deliver more sustainable products and solutions for their customers. And so she's asking if there are, are there any reliable papers or reports on how to do this, on what consumers want and need, or any advice on how to balance needs of customers versus commercial viability? I'll start with a short answer of my own, and that these are difficult problems, and this is what organizations like KPMG and what researchers at UQ are really trying to find out. And so, if you're looking for some hard advice, or at least best practice to our knowledge thus far advice, either KPMG and UQ. This is why our collaboration together is so strong, is that we both have that goal in mind, is to understand that knowledge. So in that sense, feel free to reach out. Maybe one of the panelists wants to answer this one really quick if they happen to know of any particular resource that might be useful.
Results for what, sorry?
So further reading for a business owner who wants to start making forward progress on this.
I'd be happy to follow up outside of this, but absent knowing a little bit more about the product and the organization, because there are resources out there. Often the job is actually to find and direct people to those right resources. So happy to follow up outside of this.
And can I just want to do one last plug for carbon literacy before we go, because we're in the process of developing sector-specific guidance as well. That if we know exactly what kind of product or what kind of business you're in, we might be able to at least get you started, because that's the aim of carbon literacy. It's the first step along the way to understand how your business fits in the system. So you can get in touch with us about that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Cle-Anne. UQ just launched our carbon literacy training, and I believe we're the only one in Australia that is accredited to deliver that at the moment. So yeah, it's definitely a great plug, and a good segue for me to plug the other things that I plug at this particular point in the webinar. I guess I just wanted to first thank the speakers so much for their presentations and their time, and particularly to KPMG for partnering with the business school during this thought leadership webinar. If this at all sparks your interest and you're interested in finding out more about how to partner with either UQ or KPMG, please don't hesitate to reach out. More broadly, if you are interested in furthering your education and leadership skills, we also encourage you to look broader into our MBA program. We have a number of information events. I believe there's one coming up on the 14th of November and again on the 3rd of November. So please do reach out if you're interested in really elevating by pursuing your MBA. For those alumni in the audience, and I know there's a lot of you, I also wanted to raise your attention to a new alumni mentoring platform that we have. We have almost 300,000 alumni from UQ Business School, spanning a number of different industries and countries. And so we've created this alumni to alumni flash mentoring platform to really help you connect with your global alumni community. So it's not just about us, UQ, but it's also about the connections that UQ can help facilitate in our alumni cohorts. This is an exclusive UQ mentoring and peer coaching platform. It's called the A2A, or Alumni to Alumni program. And so it really will help to open up our opportunities to share learnings and career development with other professionals, either from the perspective of a mentor or from somebody who's looking for mentoring. All right. So go ahead and use your QR code if you're interested in chasing that up. So thank you again so much for joining us this evening. As we close out, a short poll will pop up on your screen so you can let us know how the event went for you and other event topics that you might be interested in looking at in the future. Thank you again for coming, everybody, and for your time. Have a safe evening. Take care and all the best.